Hey guys, in this video I wanted to take just a quick couple of minutes and demonstrate what's the proper way whenever you are choosing to allow invoicing prior to job completion. What's the proper way to get a job into the closed section of the jobs dashboard? So just to take a look specifically at what we're looking at. If we're in company preferences, and on this left-hand side, if we scroll down, we'll see a control that reads allow invoicing prior to job completion. It's not uncommon for our customers to be set up just like this, where you're allowing invoicing prior to job completion. Of course, we wouldn't want to create invoices automatically. In most cases, that's an all or nothing setting, guys. Every job would then have an invoice created automatically if that were set to yes. And the struggle is we're invoicing jobs, and I can see that I have a closed job status category along with an invoice status category on my jobs dashboard, but I don't have any jobs in the closed jobs section of my jobs dashboard. So the question becomes, how do I continue to advance my different jobs it's shown in this linear progression of the different positions and workflow and make this thing go from an all open job, and if there's additional site visits that would be appropriate, but how does this interact with our completed and ready to close section? Do we see this thing land in a to be invoice section? When will I see it appear in the invoice section of the jobs dashboard? And then lastly, of course, the big question, how do I get this thing as far down as the closed section of the jobs dashboard? So we'll go back to our job. This job is currently in a dispatch position. Typically, we'll see whenever we're choosing to invoice a multitude of different statuses used whenever we're at that invoice stage, because once we have the ability to invoice prior to job completion, the ability to invoice is no longer limited to the status of completed. It now opens this up, so to speak, so that I can invoice regardless of the position of workflow that's represented by the current status of this job. So in this example, we'll simply choose to invoice our job. Of course, we're only presented with two options when we have this setting set to yes, notably the ability to invoice now. Once we choose to invoice now, you'll notice a slight hesitation as the invoice is generated. The screen will automatically refresh. We're now presented with an invoice number. We see a direct link to the invoice, but notice that the current status of the job didn't change. It's still in an invoice status, or it's still in a dispatch status, simply with an invoice created alongside of it. So if I went over to my jobs dashboard, even forcing a refresh to make sure that we have that most current action associated with the information that's presented on the jobs dashboard, we can see that this job is still in the dispatch status. It's one of the 11 that's being counted as a dispatched status job. We see that information corroborated here. And we can, yes, identify this is in fact the job in question, specifically with the job number. This one ends in a 2656, attributed to the customer Tommy Two-Tone Bunches. If I navigate back to the job in question, we can verify that information. Yes, this job ends in 2656, attributed to the customer Tommy Two-Tone Bunches. So we know, in fact, the action of invoicing this job, and this is specific to the use case where we have enabled the ability to invoice prior to job completion, but we can see that action caused no progression in my jobs dashboard. And so specifically with this setting, guys, the anticipation for this linear progression, as we see represented with these different status sections on our job dashboard, the expected result will be whenever I have that setting turned on, then I'm going to go from the My Job section or the All Open Job section, depending on what's appropriate. This one happens to have the same user that I'm logged in associated with it, so it's considering it a My Job status, but it's going to float down from the All Open Jobs section. It might show up in additional site visits. These would simply be a subset of the jobs summarized in the All Open Jobs section of the jobs dashboard. So even though we might see this present here as an interesting additional attribute of information associated with that job, specifically, we'll see it pass by the completed and ready to close section. We'll see it also pass by the to be invoiced, and we'll see it land in this invoice section. But we can see that right now, remember our job number 2656 is still very much in the dispatch jobs section of our jobs dashboard. Notice here we see 12 before we saw 11. It's going to show up in this subset of 11 again because this one has my name on it. And that's going to be what's associated with the My Jobs section. So the representative of all jobs in the dispatch status category in this jobs dashboard, we can certainly verify, yes, this job 2656 has not progressed further down on the jobs dashboard. So the question, of course, becomes how do we make that advancement happen? And if we navigate back into our job, the way that we'll progress this is by now choosing the completed status. So this status is the same status that's chosen when we don't have the company preference enabled to allow invoicing prior to job completion. In that case, the completed status is of ultimate importance because it's only when the job status, not an individual text status, but the overall job status is in a completed state, that I can choose to interact with the invoice action icon. In this case, I can choose to interact with the invoice action icon prior to the progression of the status of completed. But it works a little bit differently now that I have enabled the company preference to allow invoicing prior to job completion. Now when I select completed, we actually won't see completed as the current status. In fact, that'll be our way to tell the system, now that we have an invoice generated, when we choose completed, instead of being in a completed status, we're going to go ahead and jump past that section in the jobs dashboard. Remember, if we were looking at our jobs dashboard, jobs that are in a completed status have their own status section associated with these on our jobs dashboard, prime real estate, because these completed status jobs mean something very specific whenever I'm not allowing invoicing prior to job completion. This is essentially revenue waiting to be had. I just have to make sure that those jobs are in a particular state where I can generate the invoice for those. And that's where I'll have the choice if I want to close the job but invoice it later, or simply invoice it now and advance it to this section of the jobs dashboard. So for our job, once we choose that completed status, we'll see the screen refresh. You'll see completed ever so slightly, just for a quick second, and the screen will refresh into the invoiced status. So now we can see the progression back over on our jobs dashboard. We'll refresh it just to make sure it brings in the most current information. Before in the My Jobs section, I had 11 dispatched. Now I have 10. We see it decremented by a count of 1 as a result of us changing the job status to invoiced following the action of generating the invoice. And same under the All Open Jobs section of the jobs dashboard. Before I showed 12. Remember, the count was different only by 1. And now instead of 12, I see 11. I see it decremented by a count of 1 because we've invoice that job. So now when we go down to the invoice section, the expectation would be we could find a job specifically in that invoiced status category, and we see that's exactly true here. In this status category of statuses, we see specifically our job that ends in 2656. We see that's a job attributed to Tommy Two Town Bunches. So we know this is our job in question. But we still don't see that move down to the closed section of the jobs dashboard. So to offer a little bit of color there, the system still has an expectation of manually interacting with this job. Now, a lot of folks won't progress it into the closed job section of the jobs dashboard. And I say that so specifically as to not to conflate the status categories with these represented sections. Invoiced absolutely is a closed job status category. It's a status that belongs to the closed job status category of statuses, but it's not in this closed section of the jobs dashboard. So what the system is anticipating, and this actually works the same regardless of if your company preference is set to allow invoicing prior to job completion, this action would be the same. Really, the struggle is how do I advance it into the invoiced section, right? And because we generate the invoice, and we just saw that's not enough to force that progression to the invoice section. Instead, what's enough to advance it into that invoice section is generate the invoice and choose the completed status. Then we see it advance to the invoice section. If I did want to move it into the closed section, the system is anticipating that I interact with the job, and this is an expectation of giving it that final once over, so to speak. Perhaps I'm traveling to the invoice in this example, and I'm making sure that the job is completely paid. In this case, it's actually not. But assuming this invoice is completely paid, I've converted any job deposits to invoice payments. If I haven't, this is a great opportunity to do so. I can build this step into my process. And that's the intentionality behind this specific progression that we see on the jobs dashboard. Once I've done my final check for the invoice, I've done my final check of the job. Were there any completion notes that we need to address? Was there any communication that we still needed to tend to on behalf of the customer? Any unsent reminders we might need to investigate? Have we emailed the specific collateral? Everything's done. In reality, I would normally take something like a manila file folder. I would take it over to a very large lateral file cabinet, and I would painstakingly open this very large lateral file cabinet, and I would shuffle either to the T's for Tommy or two-tone or to the B's for bunches, and I would painstakingly find exactly alphabetically where this file should live in my lateral file cabinet. And I would put it away, and it would live there until I needed to reference this again, typically in 2 to 3 years, whenever Tommy Two-Tone Bunches calls me and says, hey, don't you remember when you guys came out and did that thing that you guys do? But the digital representation of that action of going to the lateral file cabinet, painstakingly open the large lateral file door and filing this thing away is simply performing those last checks, making sure everything's okay, and then we manually change the status even again. Notice the list is now abbreviated, inclusive only of the closed job status category of statuses that I'm allowed to choose from, and typically I would choose something like paid in full. Once I chose paid in full, guys, this is the action that then will progress on the jobs dashboard down into the closed jobs section of our jobs dashboard. Remember, we didn't have anything there before. We had 14 in the invoice status, but now we have 13 decremented by a count of 1 because we manually interacted with that closed job status one last time. And here's our job that ends in 2656, attributed to Tommy Two-Tone Bunches. And guys, that's going to be how we progress the job all the way into the closed section of the jobs dashboard.